I always thought camping alone would be a calming escape, a way to disconnect from the noise of daily life. The idea of solitude appealed to me, so when I got a rare long weekend off work, I packed my gear and drove out to the mountains. It wasn't my first time camping, but it was my first solo trip. I chose a remote spot in a national forest I'd visited before, far away from the usual campsites. The trail was unmarked, which meant no crowds, just the kind of quiet I was looking for. The drive took about 3 hours, with the last stretch being a winding dirt road cutting through dense pine forests. The further I went, the narrower the road became, until it was barely wide enough for my car. Low-hanging branches scraped against the windows, and the undercarriage groaned against the uneven ground. I finally parked at what felt like a dead end and stepped out into the fresh mountain air. The silence was immediate, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. I spent about an hour hiking to find the perfect spot. I wanted to be near water, so I followed the sound of a creek until I came across a clearing surrounded by tall trees. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the creek was close enough to hear, but not so loud that it would drown out other noises. Felt perfect. I set up my tent facing the water and gathered firewood from the surrounding area. By the time the sun dipped below the tree-line, the temperature had dropped sharply. I lit a fire and cooked a simple dinner, feeling proud of my little setup. The crackling fire and the rustling leaves made the place feel alive, but not in a threatening way. It was peaceful. After eating, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames as they danced and popped. Without self-service or distractions, my mind wandered to simpler things. How the stars were brighter out here, how the creek sounded like a soft conversation. I turned in early, crawling into my sleeping bag and letting the warmth lull me to sleep. I didn't realize how tired I was until my eyes closed. For a while, I slept soundly, but then something woke me. A sound just outside the tent. First, I thought it was the wind. The tent rustled lightly, and I heard twigs snapping. My heart started to race as I lay there, straining to identify the noise. It didn't sound like an animal scurrying. It was heavier, more deliberate. The fire had burned down to embers by then, and the faint glow cast long shadows on the tent walls. I told myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. Animals are curious, I thought. There's no reason to panic. But then the sound came again, closer this time. It was a distinct crunch, like a boot pressing into dry leaves. My stomach dropped. I froze, every nerve in my body on high alert. I didn't want to make a noise or move. I just lay there, my ears tuned to every little sound. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing. Then, a soft scraping noise began, like something brushing against the side of the tent. It was deliberate, not accidental. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was outside might hear it. I reached for my flashlight but hesitated before turning it on. Did I really want to see what was out there? I decided against it. Instead, I stayed still, hoping the intruder would lose interest and move on. The scraping stopped, and for a moment, there was silence again. Then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the tent. My mind raced. Could it be a person? So why weren't they saying anything? Why weren't they making themselves known? I wished I had brought something for protection, but all I had was a small utility knife and a can of bear spray. Both were in the side pocket of my backpack, just out of reach. I cursed myself for not keeping them closer. The footsteps paused directly behind the tent, and I held my breath. I could hear my pulse in my ears. After a while, the footsteps moved away. I waited, listening intently, but the sounds grew fainter until they disappeared entirely. I didn't move for a long time, too scared to risk making a noise. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I drifted off into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up, the sun was rising, casting a warm glow over the clearing. I crawled out of the tent and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but when I walked around the tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt, large, unmistakably human footprints. They circled the tent in a slow, deliberate path. I tried to convince myself it was a hiker who had gotten lost or curious about my campsite, but it didn't make sense. Why wouldn't they have called out or announced themselves? Why would they come so close in the middle of the night without making their presence known? I debated packing up and leaving, but part of me didn't want to let fear ruin my trip. I decided to stay, but to be extra cautious. I spent the day exploring the area, gathering more firewood, and making sure my camp was secure. I even hung a makeshift alarm, a few tin cans tied to a string, around the perimeter of the clearing. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little better. The second night, I stayed up late, keeping the fire going and listening for any unusual sounds. For hours, there was nothing but the normal forest noises: crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the gurgling creek. Just when I started to think I'd imagined the whole thing, I heard it again. Footsteps, coming from the direction of the trees. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my flashlight and bear spray and stood by the fire, my heart pounding. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I shone the flashlight into the trees, but the beam only illuminated dense foliage. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. There was no response, just the sound of something moving closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest was silent again. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Finally, I forced myself to sit back down by the fire, but I didn't dare go to sleep. When morning came, I made the decision to leave. As much as I wanted to tough it out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. I packed up my gear quickly, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. The forest, which had seemed so peaceful when I arrived, now felt oppressive, as if the trees themselves were hiding something. As I hiked back to my car, I kept expecting to see someone step out from behind a tree or hear footsteps following me. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my car and locked the doors, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The drive back down the dirt road was slow and tense, but eventually, I reached the highway and felt like I could breathe again. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just another camper who didn't want to share their space, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is that I've never camped alone again. The woods might seem peaceful, but out there, you're completely vulnerable, and not everything or everyone you encounter has good intentions. It was supposed to be an escape. I had spent the last few months drowning in work, staring at spreadsheets until my vision blurred. I needed fresh air and solitude, so I packed up my gear, loaded my car, and drove deep into the national forest. I wanted to be far enough from civilization that I couldn't hear cars, couldn't check emails, and couldn't see another human being. The drive was smooth, winding through the dense green of the forest, the asphalt gradually giving way to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I reached the trailhead, my car was coated in a layer of dust. I grabbed my pack and locked the car, the sound of the door slamming echoing in the stillness. The trail was steep in parts, narrow in others, but it was beautiful. Pines stretched tall above me, their needles carpeting the forest floor. Birds chirped occasionally, but mostly it was quiet, almost too quiet. A couple of times, I thought I heard rustling in the underbrush, but when I stopped to listen, it went silent. Probably just squirrels, I told myself. After hiking for about 3 hours, I found the perfect spot. It was a small clearing surrounded by trees, with a faint view of the distant mountains through a gap in the canopy. There was a fire ring someone had built long ago, now surrounded by moss and a few scattered beer cans. I cleaned it up, set up my tent, and laid out my sleeping bag. By the time I was done, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. I built a small fire, boiled water for some instant noodles, and sat back to eat, feeling more at peace than I had in weeks. The sound of the crackling fire mixed with the occasional chirp of a cricket. The air was cool but not cold, and I could feel the tension in my shoulders easing with every passing minute. When the fire died down, I decided to turn in. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and let the forest's quiet envelop me. That's when I heard it. A single sharp crack, like a branch snapping. It wasn't far from my campsite, maybe 50 yards. My eyes shot open and I held my breath, listening. The forest was silent again, but my heart was pounding. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, maybe a falling branch. Nothing to worry about. Still, I lay there, ears straining for any sound. Another crack, closer this time. I sat up, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? Maybe another camper? But why would someone else be out here so late, so far off the beaten path? I hadn't seen another soul since I left the trailhead. I reached for the flashlight by my side and clicked it on. The beam of light felt pitifully weak as I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The fire pit was just a ring of smoldering embers now, casting faint red glows on the ground. I swept the flashlight around the clearing, the beam catching nothing but trees and shadows. "Hello," I called out, instantly regretting it. My voice sounded thin and small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. No response, just silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and crawled back into my tent. But sleep didn't come easily. Every tiny rustle, every gust of wind through the trees set my nerves on edge. I kept the flashlight in my hand, the beam pointed toward the tent wall, casting a faint glow. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of something heavy, something deliberate, moving just outside my tent. It wasn't the light, skittering noise of an animal. This was slow, steady, like footsteps. I froze. My entire body tensed, and I felt like I couldn't even breathe. The steps circled the tent once, then twice. I gripped the flashlight tighter, trying to muster the courage to unzip the tent and shine the light out. But fear rooted me in place. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting up in my sleeping bag, the flashlight clutched in my hand. The first rays of sunlight finally filtered through the tent fabric, and I let out a shaky breath. I had made it through the night. When I stepped outside, I half expected to see footprints, some sign that someone or something had been there, but there was nothing. The clearing looked exactly as I had left it, except for one thing, the fire pit. Someone or something had carefully placed a small stack of stones in the center, arranged in a perfect pyramid. My stomach dropped. I hadn't done that. There was no way I could have missed it when I built the fire. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my eyes constantly darting to the tree-line. Every rustle, every snap of a twig made my heart race. I didn't stop to eat or rest. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the car felt twice as long as the hike in. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. But the trail was empty, just me and the trees. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack in the back seat and locked the doors before even starting the engine. As I drove away, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was another camper playing a prank. Maybe I was just paranoid and overreacting. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The footsteps, the stones, they weren't just random. Someone had been there. someone who didn't want to be seen. I haven't gone camping alone since. The decision to camp in the woods wasn't impulsive. It had been a few years since I last went camping, and I missed the calm of the forest. This time, I picked a location a little more remote than usual. I'd read about an area in northern Vermont, not far from where I grew up, that wasn't heavily trafficked but offered beautiful views and plenty of quiet. I needed that solitude, a break from the constant noise of everyday life. The drive took most of the morning. The winding roads were familiar, reminding me of childhood trips when my dad would take us hiking. By the time I arrived at the trailhead, the late autumn sun was just beginning to dip lower in the sky. It was a little later than I planned, but I wasn't too worried. I had my gear packed meticulously. A sturdy tent, plenty of food, water, and even a small first aid kit. The air was cool, crisp, and carried the faint smell of damp leaves. It felt like the perfect setting for a weekend away. The trail leading to my planned campsite wasn't marked well, but I had researched the area and downloaded a map on my phone. After hiking for about an hour, I found the spot, a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. It was perfect. The ground was relatively level, and there was a natural fire pit that someone had used before. I set down my pack, stretched my legs, and got to work setting up the tent. By the time I finished, the sun had started to set. The forest around me grew darker and quieter, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I gathered some dry wood and built a fire. Its warmth and light immediately made me feel more at ease. Dinner was simple, a can of chili heated over the flames. I ate slowly, listening to the crackling fire and the distant sound of an owl calling. As the night deepened, I lay back on a camping chair and stared at the stars. They were brilliant, much brighter than I ever saw back in the city. For a while, I just sat there, enjoying the peace. When the chill began to creep through my layers, I decided to call it a night. I doused the fire thoroughly, double-checked my gear, and climbed into the tent. Sleep didn't come as easily as I hoped. The quiet of the forest, while peaceful, was also unnerving. Every little noise felt amplified. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, or a small animal scurrying through the underbrush. Around midnight, I finally drifted off. I woke up suddenly, heart pounding. For a moment, I wasn't sure what had woken me. Then I heard it, a distant, steady crunching of leaves. It sounded deliberate, like footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped, and the forest returned to its silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe even a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. After a long while of listening to nothing but my racing heartbeat, I finally fell asleep again. The morning light was a relief. I emerged from the tent, stretched, and immediately scanned the area. There were no signs of anyone or anything unusual. I brushed off the uneasiness from the night before, chalking it up to my imagination. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore a bit. The woods were beautiful in the daylight. I followed a narrow trail that led to a small stream. The sound of running water was soothing, and I spent some time sitting on a rock, letting the sun warm my face. I even saw a few deer in the distance. By midday, I was feeling completely at ease again. As the sun began to lower in the sky, I made my way back to the campsite. That's when I noticed something odd. My tent looked different. First, I couldn't put my finger on it. Then I realized the flap was partially open. I was certain I had zipped it up before leaving. I approached cautiously, heart pounding again. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. My sleeping bag, my pack, nothing was missing or out of place. But the open flap nagged at me. Had I really forgotten to zip it? It didn't seem like something I would overlook. That night, I built a larger fire, hoping the light and warmth would push away the lingering unease. I stayed up later than usual, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I made sure to zip the tent securely and double-check everything. I woke up again in the middle of the night, and this time the sound was closer. Footsteps, deliberate and slow. They circled the tent, crunching the dry leaves. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The steps stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing just outside the tent. Panic surged through me. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam of light illuminated the tent's interior, but nothing else. The breathing stopped. I stayed frozen, flashlight in hand, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At dawn, I stepped out of the tent, every muscle tense. The clearing was empty, just as it had been the day before. But this time, I noticed something. Near the edge of the campsite, in the soft dirt, were footprints. They were faint but unmistakably human. My stomach turned. Someone had been there. I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. Every sound made me jump, and I constantly glanced over my shoulder. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back seat, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. Even now, I can't explain what happened. Maybe it was just someone passing through the woods, unaware I was there. Or maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I haven't been camping since. The thought of being alone in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, doesn't bring me peace anymore. It brings me fear. I always looked forward to my solo camping trips. Being out in nature, away from people and the constant buzz of the city, felt like a reset for my mind. This time, I picked a spot deeper in the woods, far from any established campground. I wanted isolation, peace, and the challenge of being entirely self-reliant. I spent a few days preparing. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, a small camping stove, enough food for 3 days, water bottles, a first aid kit, and a map of the area. I also carried my pocket knife, a fire starter kit, and an old but reliable headlamp. The weather forecast looked good, cool but clear skies. The drive to the trailhead took about 2 hours. It was early morning when I arrived, and the parking lot was empty, just the way I liked it. After a quick check of my gear, I set off. The trail was rugged, winding through dense trees, occasionally opening to glimpses of the surrounding mountains. The smell of pine and damp earth was invigorating. About 5 miles in, I veered off the marked trail to find a secluded spot to set up camp. I walked another half-mile, careful to leave markers for myself, until I found a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. It felt perfect, quiet, shaded, and far enough from the trail to ensure privacy. By late afternoon, I had my tent pitched and a small fire going. I cooked some instant noodles and sat by the fire, enjoying the silence. The only sounds were the crackling flames and the distant chirping of birds. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods became eerily dark. I could barely see the outlines of the trees against the starry sky. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and turned off the headlamp. The silence was heavy, but it didn't bother me. Sometime during the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had stirred me. It was pitch black, and the fire outside had long since died out. Then I heard it, a faint rustling noise. It sounded like something moving through the underbrush nearby. I stayed completely still, straining my ears. The sound came closer, then stopped. My heart was pounding, but I reminded myself it was probably a small animal. Raccoons, maybe, or a deer. I had hung my food bag on a tree branch away from the tent, so there was nothing inside to attract anything. But the sound started again, this time slower and more deliberate. It wasn't the quick scampering of an animal. It sounded like footsteps, cautious and steady. I reached for my knife, keeping it close, and lay still, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The footsteps circled the tent, then stopped directly behind it. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but fear rooted me in place. What if it wasn't an animal? What if someone was out here watching me? The sound didn't come back, though. After what felt like hours, I must have fallen asleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, everything looked normal, though my nerves were on edge. I found no footprints or signs that anyone had been near my tent. I convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I packed up and hiked farther into the woods, putting more distance between myself and the trail. The second day was uneventful. I found a new campsite near a small creek and spent the afternoon fishing. The clear water and rhythmic sounds helped ease my anxiety. By evening, I felt like myself again. I cooked the fish I'd caught and enjoyed the peace of the forest. But that night, it happened again. I woke to the sound of movement outside my tent. This time, it was unmistakable, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the dry leaves. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, unzipped the tent, and shone the light into the darkness. Nothing. The beam of light revealed only trees and shadows. The footsteps stopped as soon as I opened the tent, and the silence was deafening. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the fire with the knife in my hand. Every sound made me jump. By dawn, I was exhausted but determined to figure out what was going on. I spent the morning searching the area around my campsite. This time I found something, a set of boot prints in the dirt, faint but definitely human. They led away from my tent and disappeared into the woods. Panic set in. Someone had been watching me. I decided to cut my trip short and head back to the car. The hike back was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me whip around, expecting to see someone following me. I saw no one, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I threw my gear into the trunk and drove off, my heart still racing. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I noticed something chilling. In the dust on the back window of my car, someone had written 2 words, "Nice try." I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I haven't been camping alone since. I decided to spend a weekend alone in the wilderness to clear my mind. Life had been overwhelming lately, and I needed to unplug. I picked a spot about 4 hours from my home, a secluded ridge I'd found online called Crooked Pine. It wasn't a popular place, which was exactly what I wanted. Fewer people meant more peace. I packed my gear, a sturdy tent, sleeping bag, food for 2 days, a basic first aid kit, and my trusted knife. The weather forecast promised clear skies, and I felt ready for a break from everything. The drive was uneventful, but as I got closer to the trailhead, the road narrowed and turned into loose gravel. I could feel my car's tires struggling for grip on the uneven surface. There were no other cars parked when I arrived, which reassured me I'd have the area to myself. The stillness was comforting at first, but as I hoisted my pack and started hiking, I noticed just how silent the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. After about 3 hours of steady hiking, I reached the ridge. The view was spectacular. Rolling hills stretched out below, a mix of evergreen trees and rocky outcrops. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in soft pink and orange hues. I set up my tent in a flat clearing, carefully checking the ground for rocks or sticks. By the time I got everything ready, the air had cooled, and I was grateful for the insulated jacket I'd packed. Dinner was a simple affair, freeze-dried chili heated over a small camping stove. As I ate, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves from being alone. This wasn't my first solo camping trip, but something about the stillness here was different. Normally, the forest buzzed with life, but tonight it was utterly quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. After cleaning up and securing my food in a bear canister a good distance from my tent, I crawled into my sleeping bag. The tent felt small and fragile against the vast darkness outside. I fell asleep faster than I expected, probably from the hike and fresh air. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. It wasn't noise that startled me awake. It was the lack of it. The forest was so silent it felt unnatural. I lay still, listening for anything, an animal, the wind, even a creak from the trees. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching sound. Footsteps. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but these were too deliberate, too steady. They were coming from the direction of my food canister. My first instinct was to grab my knife, which I kept next to my sleeping bag. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm and think. If it was a bear, I didn't want to startle it by making noise. If it wasn't, I didn't want to think about that. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever or whatever it was, they were walking around my camp. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then the steps stopped right outside my tent. My mind raced. Should I call out? Stay quiet? The tent fabric rustled as something or someone brushed against it. I tightened my grip on the knife, every muscle in my body tense. The sound moved away, back toward the clearing. I waited, listening for what felt like hours, but it didn't return. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent slowly, scanning the area. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The bear canister was untouched, but then I saw the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, large and deep, circling my tent. My stomach churned. I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and the ridge wasn't easy to access. Whoever had been here had gone out of their way to find me. I debated what to do. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but I felt silly for being so shaken. Maybe it was just another camper who didn't realize I was here. I convinced myself to stay, though I couldn't shake the unease gnawing at me. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I spent it exploring the ridge, trying to enjoy the scenery. But I kept glancing over my shoulder, my mind replaying the events of the night before. When evening came, I built a small fire to keep myself busy and create some sense of security. The flames flickered and danced, casting long shadows that made the forest seem alive. I decided to sleep with my knife in my hand that night. The footsteps hadn't returned, but the paranoia lingered. Every creak of the trees or rustle of leaves made my heart race. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I drifted off. I woke up again in the early hours, just before dawn. This time, the sound was unmistakable. The sharp crack of a twig snapping nearby. My pulse quickened. I lay there, knife ready, waiting. Then I heard the footsteps again. Slower this time, almost cautious. They stopped, then started again, circling my tent once more. Suddenly, there was a low thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. I held my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. Minutes passed. The footsteps didn't return, but the silence felt heavier than ever. When daylight came, I stepped outside cautiously. That's when I saw it. A small pile of stones stacked neatly in front of my tent. It hadn't been there the night before. My skin prickled as I realized whoever had been here was trying to send a message. I didn't stick around to figure out what it meant. I packed up in record time, shoving everything haphazardly into my pack. The hike back to the trailhead felt like an eternity. Every rustle or crack in the woods made me jump. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. But as I loaded my gear into the trunk, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the dusty back window of my car, someone had drawn a simple smiley face with their finger. I never went back to Crooked Pine. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there with me, but every time I think about going camping alone, I remember that smiley face and the eerie silence of that ridge. Some places are better left unexplored. I always loved the idea of solo camping. Growing up in Vermont, it had been a family tradition to hike the trails and camp in the dense woods that surrounded my childhood home. When I moved to Switzerland for work, I was eager to explore the Alpine forests. There was something serene about being out there, alone with the mountains, the trees, and the distant sound of water rushing through creeks. I'd camped many times in Switzerland, but this trip was different. It wasn't just a weekend escape. I planned for an extended trip to really immerse myself in the wilderness. The journey started smoothly enough. I had my pack loaded with all the essentials: food, water, a reliable tent, sleeping gear, and a first aid kit. I had researched a lesser-known trail that wound through a stretch of forest known for its solitude. This wasn't a tourist-heavy area. I wanted peace, not crowds. The plan was to hike deep into the woods, set up camp by a small lake I had spotted on a topographical map, and spend a few nights enjoying the quiet. The first day of hiking was uneventful. The trail was well-marked, though narrow, and the trees were dense enough that I felt the temperature drop slightly as I ventured deeper. I followed a small stream that eventually widened, leading me toward the lake I had planned to camp near. By late afternoon, I reached the spot, a perfect clearing near the water, with just enough flat ground to pitch my tent. The lake was pristine, reflecting the surrounding pines like a mirror. After setting up camp, I took some time to gather firewood, taking care to stay within sight of my tent. The forest felt alive but not overwhelming. Birds called to one another, and the occasional rustle of leaves reminded me of how far I was from the modern world. By the time I lit my fire and cooked a simple meal, the sky had begun to darken. The stars were brilliant against the inky blackness, and the silence around me was profound. The first night passed without incident. I woke early, feeling refreshed, and spent the day exploring the area around the lake. I climbed a small ridge nearby and discovered a breathtaking view of the forest stretching endlessly below. I felt completely at peace. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I noticed a shift in the atmosphere. The woods seemed quieter than the night before. The usual sounds of nocturnal animals, crickets, owls, even the distant rustling of underbrush, were absent. I brushed it off as my imagination, blaming my nerves for the unease creeping over me. The second night was when things began to change. Around midnight, I woke abruptly. My tent was zipped shut, and I lay still, listening. At first, I thought it was the sound of the wind, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't the wind. It was a faint, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. Maybe a deer had wandered close to my camp. But the sound didn't fade or wander off. It grew closer, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there was moving toward my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peer outside. The beam of light swept through the trees, revealing nothing but the shadows of the forest. The sound stopped as soon as I opened the tent. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps. I waited, holding my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe just a branch falling or an animal scurrying away. I zipped the tent shut and forced myself to lie back down. Sleep didn't come easily, but the rest of the night was uneventful. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. Around my campsite, in the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing, were footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. They were larger, and the pattern in the sole didn't match my hiking boots. Someone had been there during the night, close enough to see my tent, close enough to watch me. I debated packing up and leaving, but I had planned to stay another night. The thought of cutting my trip short felt like giving in to paranoia. I told myself it could have been another hiker, though the odds of that seemed slim given how remote the area was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I spent the day on edge, keeping close to camp and constantly scanning the trees. The woods that had felt so inviting now seemed oppressive, the towering pines closing in around me. Every snapping twig made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. That night, I built a larger fire and kept my flashlight within reach. I tried to read to distract myself, but my eyes kept darting to the dark forest beyond the firelight. Hours passed, and the fire burned low. I was about to add more wood when I heard it again. The crunching footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my camp. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam illuminated the trees, but no one was there. The footsteps stopped again, but I knew whoever it was hadn't left. They were out there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, adding wood to keep it blazing, and kept my flashlight in hand. When dawn finally broke, I wasted no time packing up my gear. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back was tense. Every noise made me whip around, expecting to see someone or something following me. But the forest remained eerily quiet, as if it too was holding its breath. When I finally reached my car at the trailhead, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. As I loaded my gear and started the engine, I glanced back at the trail, half expecting to see someone emerge from the woods. No one did. I never found out who or what had been out there. Part of me wonders if it was just another camper, curious about my presence. But another part of me knows better. There was something deliberate about the way they moved, about the way they stayed just out of sight. I haven't been back to that trail since. Camping, for me, has lost some of its charm. The wilderness used to feel like a refuge, a place to escape. Now, it feels like a place where I'm vulnerable, exposed. Maybe I'll go back one day, but for now, I'm staying close to home. I had always been the kind of person who loved solitude. Growing up in Vermont, camping trips were a normal part of my life. My parents used to take me into the woods every summer, teaching me how to pitch a tent, make a fire, and navigate using a map. Moving to Switzerland years later hadn't changed that about me. I still felt at home in the wild, far from the noise and rush of everyday life. That summer, I decided to take a solo trip into a less traveled part of the Jura Mountains. It wasn't a well-marked trail, which was part of the appeal. I wanted to escape the crowds and have some quiet time. The area wasn't completely off the map, but it wasn't exactly a tourist hotspot either. I spent hours planning the route, double-checking the weather forecast, and packing all the essentials. My gear included a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, enough food for 3 days, a flashlight, a power bank, and a knife. I even brought a small first aid kit because I liked being prepared. The first day of the hike was beautiful. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the trail and the occasional chirping of birds. I felt alive in a way that was hard to describe. I made good time and reached a clearing I had marked on my map by late afternoon. It was a perfect spot to set up camp. The clearing was surrounded by tall trees, and there was a small stream nearby. The water was cold and clear, and I used it to refill my bottles. After setting up the tent, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. The evening was calm, and I sat by the flames, eating a simple meal of instant noodles and jerky. The stars were starting to come out, and I felt that deep, peaceful connection to nature that only camping can bring. The next morning, I decided to explore the area a bit. I left my tent and heavier gear behind, taking only a small backpack with water, snacks, and my map. The forest was dense, but I kept track of my direction carefully, marking my trail as I went. After about an hour, I found a rocky outcrop that offered a stunning view of the valley below. It was worth the hike. I sat there for a while, enjoying the breeze and taking in the scenery. When I decided to head back to camp, I noticed something odd. The trail I had marked wasn't as clear as I remembered. The forest looked different somehow, though I knew it was impossible. I hadn't gone that far, and I was sure I had followed the same path back. Still, I couldn't find the small marks I had left on the trees. Panic started to creep in, but I pushed it aside. I was experienced enough to know that staying calm was crucial. I took out my map and compass, retracing my steps mentally. It took longer than I expected, but I finally found a familiar landmark, a fallen tree near a distinctive boulder. From there, I made it back to camp. By the time I returned, the sun was low in the sky. I was exhausted but relieved. I hadn't gone far off course, but the experience rattled me. I cooked another simple meal and sat by the fire, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was just a small mistake, nothing to worry about. That night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, but as I lay there in the dark, it became clearer. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the tent. My heart raced. I reached for the knife I kept near my sleeping bag and listened, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped. I waited, straining to hear any other sounds, but there was only silence. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it must have been an animal. Maybe a deer or a fox had wandered close to the camp. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though it wasn't a restful night. The next morning, I found no signs of anything unusual around the campsite. No tracks, no disturbed ground, nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to stick closer to camp that day. I spent the morning fishing in the stream and the afternoon gathering more firewood. As the day wore on, that sense of unease grew stronger. It was hard to pinpoint why. Maybe it was the eerie silence that had settled over the forest, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. By evening, I was ready to call it a night and leave early the next morning. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were closer, circling the tent. I froze, gripping my knife tightly. I didn't dare make a sound. The footsteps stopped again, but I could feel the presence of something, or someone, just outside. When dawn broke, I packed up my gear in record time. I didn't bother with breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the trailhead was nerve-wracking. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the parking lot, my car was a sight for sore eyes. I threw my gear in the back and drove off without looking back. It wasn't until I was home, safe in my apartment, that I let myself fully process what had happened. I still don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe it wasn't. What I do know is that the woods didn't feel the same after that trip. Something had changed. I still love camping, but I'm more cautious now. I stick to well-traveled trails and make sure to camp near other people when I can. Sometimes, late at night, I think about those footsteps. I wonder who or what was watching me in the dark, and I wonder if they'll ever find me again. When I decided to go camping alone, I thought it would be the reset I needed. I'd spent months tied to a desk, watching my life pass me by through a screen. Vermont's forests always held a special place in my heart, quiet, vast, and untouched. I had spent countless weekends exploring trails with my family as a kid, and it felt natural to return there to clear my head. This trip wasn't meant to be complicated, just me, my gear, and 2 nights away from everything. I chose a spot near a place called Dunore Gap, a stretch of forest I'd read about in an old hiking guide. It was supposed to be beautiful yet less trafficked, perfect for some peace. I arrived in the early afternoon and parked at a small, unmarked pull-off near the trailhead. My car was the only one there, which suited me fine. After checking the map and ensuring I had everything, I loaded my pack and headed in. The trail wound gently at first, a soft carpet of pine needles muffling my footsteps. The air was cool but not cold, with that crisp smell of damp earth and leaves you only get in the woods. About 2 miles in, I found an ideal spot to set up camp. A small clearing just far enough off the trail to feel secluded. It was near a creek, the gentle sound of running water adding to the serenity. I pitched my tent quickly, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood for a small fire later. The rest of the day went as planned. I explored the area, walked along the creek, and even spotted a few deer in the distance. The isolation was exactly what I needed. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal. Darkness settled in fast, and soon the only light came from the flickering flames and the stars above. I slept surprisingly well that night, waking up just once when a rustling noise outside my tent startled me. I assumed it was a small animal, probably a raccoon, and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to hike further up the trail, leaving most of my gear at the campsite. I carried just the essentials: water, snacks, and a small knife clipped to my belt. The trail became steeper as I climbed, the forest growing denser. The trees seemed taller here, their branches intertwining overhead to block out much of the sky. About an hour into the hike, I noticed something odd. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves had quieted. It wasn't silent, but it felt muted. At first, I chalked it up to the altitude or maybe my imagination. But then I saw something that made me pause. A few yards off the trail, partially hidden by underbrush, was an old campsite. At least that's what it looked like. There was a fire pit ringed with stones, long cold and overgrown with moss. Nearby, a shredded tarp hung from the branches of a tree, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It was clear no one had been there in years. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer to inspect it. Scattered around were items that didn't belong, things you wouldn't leave behind if you'd packed up properly. A rusted cooking pot, a moldy hiking boot, and what looked like the remains of a tent pole. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was probably just an old, abandoned camp. Maybe someone had left in a hurry or forgotten these things. Still, something about the scene didn't sit right with me. The boot wasn't just abandoned. It was torn, almost as if it had been ripped apart. I didn't stay long. The eerie stillness pressed down on me, and I felt an irrational urge to leave. Quickly retracing my steps, I returned to my campsite. By the time I got back, the sun was high overhead, and the normal sounds of the forest had returned. I felt foolish for letting myself get spooked. I spent the afternoon reading and fishing in the creek, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, I built another fire and settled in. The air had grown colder, and I wrapped myself in a jacket as I stared into the flames. The crackling firewood was comforting, a stark contrast to the earlier unease. But the peace didn't last. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound, a faint crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, listening intently. It wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too heavy. My heart pounded as I strained to hear more. The noise stopped, and for a moment I thought whoever or whatever it was had gone. But then came another sound, a low, guttural scraping, like something being dragged through the dirt. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, my hands shaking as I unzipped the tent. Shining the beam around, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. The noise had stopped, but the unease remained. I sat awake for hours, the knife clutched tightly in my hand, until exhaustion finally overcame me. The next morning, I decided to pack up and head back. The trip had taken a turn I hadn't expected, and I didn't want to push my luck. As I dismantled my tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing were tracks. Not animal tracks, but large, boot-shaped prints. They circled my campsite, overlapping in some places as if whoever had made them had been pacing. I felt exposed, vulnerable. I hurriedly packed the rest of my gear and started back down the trail. Every rustle and crack of a branch set my nerves on edge. About halfway back to the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a low tree branch was a small bundle of sticks, bound together with twine. It looked crude, almost like a child's craft project, but its placement felt deliberate. I didn't stop to inspect it. I pushed forward, practically jogging the last mile to the parking area. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the back and jumped inside, locking the doors immediately. As I started the engine and pulled onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. No one was there. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even after I reached the safety of my apartment. I checked the locks twice that night and slept with the lights on. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I searched online for any reports of strange activity near Dunore Gap but found nothing. Part of me wondered if it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined the tracks or the bundle of sticks. Someone or something had been out there watching me. I haven't been camping alone since. I still remember that weekend vividly, though I wish I didn't. It was supposed to be a short camping trip to clear my head. Life had been weighing on me lately, work stress, bills piling up, and the endless monotony of daily life. I thought a couple of nights out in the wilderness would be the perfect escape. No phone service, no emails, just me, the woods, and the peace I thought I'd find out there. Black Hollow Trail wasn't a well-known camping spot, and that's why I chose it. Most people preferred the more accessible, family-friendly trails with designated campsites and lots of other hikers. Black Hollow, on the other hand, was tucked away in the foothills of the Green Mountains, with only a small parking area and a single sign marking the start of the trail. I'd found it mentioned in an old forum post about hidden gem camping spots, and after some light research, I packed my gear and headed out early on a Friday morning. The trail itself was beautiful, especially in late autumn. The leaves were shades of amber and crimson, crunching under my boots as I hiked deeper into the woods. The air was crisp but not too cold, just perfect for hiking. I had a sturdy pack with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a portable stove, and some basic survival gear. I'd planned to set up camp about 5 miles in, near a small clearing by a creek I'd read about. Took me about 3 hours to reach the spot. The clearing was as picturesque as I'd imagined, surrounded by towering maple and oak trees, with the creek babbling softly nearby. I set up my tent near the water, careful to keep it a good distance from the bank in case it rained. After everything was in place, I sat on a fallen log, ate a quick lunch, and took in the quiet. No cars, no people, just the sound of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal of instant noodles, read a book by flashlight, and fell asleep early. The cold seeped into the tent as the night went on, but my sleeping bag kept me warm enough. When I woke up the next morning, I felt refreshed, like I'd finally gotten the deep sleep I hadn't had in months. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area around my campsite. The creek twisted and turned through the woods, and I followed it for a while, hopping over rocks and fallen branches. I found animal tracks here and there, deer, raccoon, and what looked like fox prints. It was peaceful, and I started to think this trip was exactly what I needed. That peace didn't last long. Around midday, as I was making my way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A faint smell in the air, sharp and metallic, like blood. At first, I thought maybe it was just a dead animal nearby, but the scent grew stronger as I got closer to the clearing. When I reached my campsite, my stomach dropped. My tent was slashed open. The fabric hung in jagged strips, and my gear was scattered across the ground. My food bag had been torn apart, its contents strewn around. At first, I thought it might have been a bear, but there were no claw marks on the trees or the tent poles, and none of my gear was crushed. Whatever did this wasn't large. I scanned the area, heart pounding. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the distant sound of the creek. I crouched and inspected the tracks around my camp. Among the usual animal prints, there were others, boot prints. Human. Someone had been here. I tried to stay calm as I gathered my things. My first instinct was to pack up and leave, but the thought of hiking 5 miles back to the car with the possibility of whoever did this still being nearby made my skin crawl. Instead, I decided to move my camp. I grabbed what I could salvage, my sleeping bag, flashlight, and some food that wasn't ruined, and headed deeper into the woods, away from the trail. I found another spot about a mile away, a smaller clearing surrounded by dense trees. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. I set up a makeshift camp and decided to skip dinner. My appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. That night, I hardly slept. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept my flashlight and knife within arm's reach, jumping at shadows until exhaustion finally pulled me under. I woke up to a soft noise, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching softly on the fallen leaves. My breath caught in my throat as I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The steps stopped just outside the clearing, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, a low whistle. It was a simple tune, slow and haunting. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to hide. My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. Confronting them seemed like a terrible idea, but staying put felt just as dangerous. I quietly unzipped my sleeping bag and grabbed my flashlight and knife. The whistling stopped. The footsteps started again, circling the edge of the clearing. I couldn't see anything in the darkness beyond my flashlight's beam, but I could feel the presence, heavy and oppressive. Summoning every ounce of courage, I flicked on the flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees. The footsteps stopped again. My hand shook as I held the knife, my eyes darting around the clearing. Minutes felt like hours before I finally heard the footsteps retreating into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, heart pounding in my chest. At first light, I packed up and started back toward the trailhead. Every step felt like a sprint, my ears straining for any sound of pursuit. When I finally reached the parking area and saw my car, I almost cried with relief. As I loaded my gear into the trunk, I noticed something wedged under the windshield wiper. It was a small, folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. Written in jagged, uneven letters were 4 words. "You're lucky this time I didn't stick around to think about it." I jumped in the car and drove until the trailhead was miles behind me. To this day, I don't know who was out there or what they wanted. I haven't been camping since, and I probably never will again. The woods, once a place of peace and solitude, now feel like a trap, a place where you're utterly alone, but never truly alone.